or maybe even within my classroom. But there's all these banned book stuff out here, and there's all this political stuff. And I'm like, I'm nervous about how to approach this. Is there a way to utilize Civility to implement some sort of initiative for increasing the amount of diverse books within the school?
I think so. I mean, I taught in LA Unified. I was a secondary school teacher. And some of the ways in which, to diversify my my library for my students would be to speak directly to the parents and say, we want to get some more books about Black history, but, we're limited by budget. And so, it would be really nice if, you could just donate 1 or 2 books to us. That would help us. And so where the Civility would come in here is that the conversation I would have with the principal, and I'm thinking exactly of what happened with the principal that I had, who was not encouraging with regards to diversity in our textbooks. But when I approached it from saying that parents would pay for the books, this principal was way more receptive to that idea.
So it wasn't necessarily coming from you, right? It was more like you're saying, oh, the parents want the books.
Yes. And so there was a kind of, I wasn't asking, for the school budget to be used on these books. I was saying that the parents want these, they want these topics, and the parents are willing to fund it by purchasing books. I didn't say that I only asked the parent to pay, for 1 book at a time or one book per child. I didn't go all into those details. I didn't need to. I sold the principal on the idea that it wouldn't be the responsibility of the school to do it, and that it's coming from the parents, even though it was really my idea.
I love that. So sly, very, very sly.
Yeah. I mean, and even when Claudia Hampton, even though she was working in the higher ed context, she put together partnerships between LA Unified School District and the Cal State system. And so in order to increase the number of Black and Latino, the Cal States are willing to have some faculty members come teach on your campus, teach classes for your gifted and high achieving students. And if the students do well, we'll be able to get them a scholarship into the Cal State University. And so she was constantly looking for opportunities to increase the number of Black and brown students in the university. In fact, she's responsible for the creation of a STEM-based STEM magnet that was catered toward Black and Latino students out here in California. It was her brainchild. And when Los Angeles Unified School District superintendent turned her down, she went to Long Beach. Long Beach said, oh yeah, we'll absolutely do it. And so to this day, that school site is on the campus of a 4-year institution out here. And it has an 86% student full scholarships to 4-year institutions. And that's all because she had done some, sly civility. And she also cajoled the chancellor of the 4-year institutions, the Cal States, to give money to the Young Black Scholars Program that was created by 100 Black men in Los Angeles. So they got like a $500,000 grant because the university wasn't doing good with recruiting Black male students. And so she, used her reputation in order to bring about change for Black men.
Okay. So here's the question, because again, gears are turning. What are some strategies? Because, okay, let's just say I can't cook. Right, because I can do a little something. I can boil some water. Okay, let's just say I'm not the most savvy when it comes to cooking. Let's say I'm not the best golfer, and so meeting a group of folks on the golf course is not gonna. What are some other strategies that I could utilize that are sly enough where I can, again, have those conversations? I can get that seat at the table, if you will. What are some strategies that you can share with us?
Yeah, so Hampton not only cooked for people or sent Christmas cards, but she would take them out to lunch after a board meeting. She would meet them. Keep in mind, this is the 70s and the 80s. She would go, have cigarette breaks with them. There were a few very conservative men on the board who she didn't get along with in terms of politics, but they would go have a cigarette break together. And so it was just little small things that she did. She took very meticulous notes about each board member. In her first year, she didn't say a word. She absolutely didn't talk. And in this interview that I found of her, she said she did that on purpose so that she could study the board culture. And it afforded her the opportunity to figure out what were the majority of the men on the board interested in. They were mostly interested in finance and buildings. And so they weren't interested in educational policy. And so she said, well, that's the place where I'm going to go, is educational policy, because that's where I can make the most change. And that's where most of the debate about affirmative action was educational policy. So she studied them. She knew one guy, for example, he was one of the more powerful trustees, a man by the name of Charles Luckman. And she knew that he was powerful because he was a world-renowned architect. And so in order to prove to him that she was a moderate, he was debating about how high to put a mound at one of the campuses, she said, whatever Luckman wanted, he was going to get it, because I wanted to make sure that the predominantly Black campus, Cal State Dominguez Hills, would get the person I wanted. So in order to kind of make sure that happened, I would trade votes with him. She called it the game of boardsmanship. And so she studied them, and then she was extremely prepared for meetings. So she would have a meeting before she would do the hosting, there was a Black man who was the first affirmative action officer. She would meet with him first. They would strategize the votes. She would cook dinner, meet with the white guys, negotiate, and then she would go to the board meetings. So the way she conducted herself in meetings was a lot of preparation and a lot of, making sure when she was board chair, because she became board chair 5 years into being on the board, she would make sure that all of her allies got to speak first. And then everybody who was against her, they would have to defend themselves. So she would call on the folks who were pro affirmative action and let them make their points. And so she just knew how to do this very well. But that was because she had worked in the K-12 setting for almost 30, 40 years and was also responsible for monitoring the desegregation efforts of LA Unified School District from the 1960s onward.
This reminds me of, I don't know if you read the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And I just hear all of that within the way that you're framing this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, in the book, and one of the chapters is just kind of detail how she built her capital by building these friendships and these relationships. She served on 9 of the 10 major committees on the board. She would do things like go to committee meetings that had nothing to do with her assignments, but because she needed to be apprised of what was happening somewhere else, because it might impact the things that she was advocating for. And so by the time she had become board chair 5 years in, she had enough capital where she could influence major votes to the point where Ronald Reagan, who appointed her as trustee later in the 1980s, when he became president, appointed her to a federal commission. I was amazed that she was appointed by Reagan, knowing his politics. Like, how the world did this happen? So in the book, I detail how she won over Ronald Reagan, which seems just, it seems so far-fetched to me. And once she served on the board for 20 years, and by the time she was about halfway through, about 10 years in, she could really start to take on gender issues more. In the beginning, she mostly dealt with race. But about 10 years into it, because she had enough capital and people around the state loved her, the presidents loved her, the students loved her. Even when she was dealing with some really tough racial politics between Black and Brown, she came away from a lot of these things unscathed because she had built personal relationships.
Would you say that her tactics of not just in your face, change this now, this needs to happen right away, contributed to a lot of her success?
Oh, most definitely. So she was appointed when Reagan was leaving the governorship and when Jerry Brown was coming in. And so Jerry Brown's appointments were all pretty much, more radical left. And she was the conciliator between the Reagan appointees who were conservative, hard right, and the Brown appointees who were hard left. And so she was like plunk right in the middle. And they all would come to her for advice and counsel because they thought that she was the most level-headed person out of the whole bunch. And I would say that not being radical worked for her. Now, keeping in mind that she's coming at a time when Black radicalism is ruling the kind of social politics of the day, because there's a backlash against all of the policies that happened during the civil rights movement. There's a backlash against affirmative action. There is this kind of, the police brutality is increased. And so Black radicalism is the response to that in the wider sphere. But Hampton realizes and understands that she has to work on the inside while people who are on the outside might be pushing for a more aggressive type of politics. You need both. You need the liberal insiders and the radical activists, because if you're working for the same goal, you need multiple approaches toward that goal. It can't be one or the other.
I support that so much. I say sometimes, like, look, I'm not gonna protest, I'm not gonna march, but I believe it's necessary. I believe that that's gonna bring a lot of awareness. I'm a hurt people in their pockets, so I'm all for a boycott. Like, I'm down. You tell me not to buy somewhere or shop or watch or whatever, I'm down, because that's, to me, I think that's necessary as well. So I feel like a combination of like protests, demonstrations, then a combination of, again, boycotts and all that, and then you have your leadership. I'm a big fan of Dr. King, and I'm also a big fan of Malcolm X. And I feel like the two of them during that time frame, in order for a lot of the changes that took place during the civil rights movement, was because of the two of them. I don't know if Dr. King would have gotten as much as he was able to accomplish if Malcolm X wasn't on very simple, like, again, same necessarily, not necessarily same path, but just different approaches to civil rights. I don't know if those changes would have taken place had them both not been prevalent during that time frame.
Yeah, I think we need to open up. People get very entrenched in their one side and not realizing that issues are complex and people are complex, and you need all of the sides working together. If your goal is equality for everybody, it doesn't have to mean that there's only one way to do it. There's plenty of examples. Mary McLeod Bethune took what is called a pragmatic idealist approach. So she took the pragmatism of Booker T. Washington and she took the idealism of Du Bois, and she merged them together when she put her curriculum together for Bethune-Cookman College. So the students would get the practical education that would help you make money from Booker T. Washington. So that would be half of their curriculum. And then the other half would be the idealistic, learn the liberal arts so that you can defend yourself in court from Du Bois. So she merged the two together. It doesn't have to be a either or.
And they didn't even like each other. Like, when I read Souls of Black Folks, I said, man, these dudes hate each other.
Oh yeah, and if you look in Booker T. Washington's papers, he has written letters to Andrew Carnegie disavowing Du Bois as a folly, some type of aberration.
So it's interesting, like, as I'm listening to you talk about Mary McLeod Bethune and how she took pieces of both of their philosophies in order to start her curriculum, even though, again, they didn't even like each other, but there are principles that were available that could be utilized as well. So thank you for that.